Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a topic where history and pop culture rumors absolutely collide. The myth versus the reality of Adolf Hitler. My goal here is to take this incredibly complex, deeply dark historical subject and lay it all out clearly for you. We're going to prioritize rigorous historical facts, look closely at the data, and separate the actual historical record from all that sensationalized gossip that's kind of clouded it over the decades.
Okay, let's just jump right in by addressing a rumor you've probably heard. It's this persistent piece of trivia that constantly floats around the internet, pops up in casual conversations, and sneaks into pop history debates. Did Adolf Hitler die a virgin? It's definitely a provocative question, right? And it immediately makes us step back and question what we actually know for sure about the private lives of major historical figures. Well, the answer is a blunt, factual no. Adolf Hitler almost certainly did not die a virgin. Historians are virtually unanimous on this point. But if it's completely untrue, why is this myth so incredibly pervasive? Where did we all even get this idea?
It turns out this piece of pop culture fiction largely stems from a massive 1977 bestseller called The Book of Lists. This book compiled endless pages of fun trivia, including a highly sensationalized chapter titled 11 Renowned People Who Died Virgins. And yep, they slopped Hitler right on that list. In reality, the historical record shows he was neither asexual nor a lifelong virgin. But, that book prioritized grabby trivia over rigorous evidence, and in doing so, it cemented a myth in the public consciousness that literally still survives today.
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll fully debunk this virgin myth and look at the origins of the gossip. Then, we'll pull back the curtain on his very real, very dark private life. From there, we'll shift into a strict historical timeline, exploring his youth and radicalization, his rise to power, the grim reality of the Holocaust, and finally, World War II and his ultimate downfall.
Section 1. The Virgin Myth Debunked, focusing on the origins of the gossip. How exactly did such a widespread, historically inaccurate myth about his personal life actually get its start well before that 1977 book was even a thing?
Interestingly enough, this rumor actually grew from two completely opposing forces. On one hand, Hitler's own propaganda machine purposefully cultivated an image of him as this ascetic, superhuman leader who had absolutely no time for romance or a normal family life. He essentially sold the German public the illusion that he was entirely married to Germany, keeping his actual private life strictly under wraps. But simultaneously, you had Allied wartime intelligence, groups like the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, trying to psychoanalyze him from afar. To paint him as deviant or weak, they started floating wild theories about his sexuality, throwing out speculative ideas like impotence or asexuality. So you take his own fake public image, combine it with wartime guesswork, and boom, you have a perfect storm for this myth to take deep root.
Section 2. A Dark Private Life Behind Closed Doors. Because the reality was vastly different from the ascetic propaganda he was feeding the public. Let's shift our focus to his actual, intimate relationships.
Behind closed doors, the realities were stark. For over a decade, his mistress was Eva Braun. They lived together at his retreat in the Bavarian Alps, and later on in the Berlin bunker. But again, to preserve that whole married to Germany illusion, she was kept entirely out of sight and was never allowed to attend official functions. They were finally married in a brief civil ceremony literally just hours before they committed suicide. But there's an even darker chapter here involving Gyli Rabal, his half-niece. Before Eva, he had an intensely obsessive and controlling relationship with Gyli. She lived in his Munich apartment until she tragically died by suicide in 1931, notably using his pistol. Historians agreed this relationship was intimate, even if the exact boundaries remain a bit murky. But it absolutely paints a deeply unsettling picture of his private world.
Section 3. Youth and Radicalization, covering 1889 to 1918. We're now going to pivot and take a highly objective clinical look at the chronological timeline. We really need to understand how a failed artist ultimately transformed into a totalitarian dictator.
So, in 1889, he was born in Austria, a poor student suffering under a fiercely abusive father. Moving into the 1900s, he travels to Vienna with big dreams of becoming a famous artist, but is actually rejected twice by the Academy of Fine Arts. His life just unravels into poverty and homeless shelters, and it's in this incredibly bitter environment that his virulent anti-Semitism and extreme German nationalism truly take root, as he basically begins blaming all of his personal failures on the Jewish people. Then, 1914 rolls around and World War I breaks out. He finds a renewed sense of purpose volunteering as a trench runner for the German army. But by 1918, Germany surrenders while he happens to be recovering from a mustard gas attack. He is absolutely devastated and latches on to the stab-in-the-back myth. This was a completely baseless conspiracy theory claiming Germany didn't actually lose on the battlefield but was instead betrayed at home by Jews and left-wing politicians.
Section 4. The Rise to Power, covering 1919 to 1933. Following the war, he returned to Munich and discovered something that would literally change history: a mesmerizing, aggressive talent for public speaking. Across the next decade, you really see this dark momentum build. In 1919, he joins a tiny, radical right-wing group that eventually transforms into the Nazi Party. Jump to 1923, he attempts to violently overthrow the government in the beer hall putsch. It fails miserably, sending him to prison where he dictates Mein Kampf, essentially laying out his entire racist ideology, his intense hatred of Jews, and his plans for Eastern European conquest. Then a massive turning point arrives in 1919. The Great Depression hits, collapsing the German economy and leaving millions starving and unemployed. And this starkly illustrates his political opportunism. Notice how he capitalized on the sheer desperation of the populace. He promised to restore German glory, promised to tear up the punishing Treaty of Versailles. Through a terrifying combination of political maneuvering and brutal street violence, this momentum culminated in 1933 when he was officially appointed chancellor.
Section 5. Dictatorship and the Holocaust, the totalitarian state. Because once he achieved that position of chancellor, the fragile German democracy was rapidly and systematically dismantled. He completely outlawed opposing political parties, established concentration camps for dissidents, and engineered a totalitarian state driven entirely by his obsessive hatred.
His ideology culminated in the Holocaust, a systematic, state-sponsored genocide of unimaginable scale. The victims of this atrocity included 6 million European Jews, alongside millions of others targeted by the regime. This included the Romani people, people with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, and homosexuals. It is a staggering, grim reality of millions of lives systematically destroyed by a massive state machinery built on.
Section 6. World War II and Downfall, spanning 1939 to 1945. After launching the war and achieving terrifyingly swift victories across Europe, his own arrogance actually triggered a catastrophic collapse.
His early military successes were very quickly overshadowed by some fatal, arrogant blunders. In 1939, he invaded Poland, which is what triggered World War II. But then, despite his early momentum, he inexplicably declared war on the United States, bringing a massive industrial superpower directly into the fight. Finally, he broke a non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union. By doing this, he forced Germany into a massive, grueling, two-front war that it simply could not win. These decisions effectively sealed his fate.
Which brings us to the very end of the historical timeline. By April 30th, 1945, the so-called thousand-year Reich he had promised was basically reduced to smoking rubble. With the Soviet Red Army literally just blocks away from his underground bunker in Berlin, he and his new wife Eva Braun committed suicide. They chose to end their lives rather than face capture and an international trial for their monumental crimes.
I want to leave you with this really powerful, sobering quote drawn directly from our sources. Hitler's life is a grim study in how deep personal resentment, paired with a fractured society, can lead to catastrophic global ruin. It's so absolutely vital to understand these historical facts, from the origins of silly pop culture myths all the way to the terrifying steps of a totalitarian takeover. But here is what you should really take away from this today. If personal resentment and societal fractures could be exploited to cause such unimaginable devastation back then, how vulnerable are our own fractured societies to the exact same manipulation today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.